Hey everyone, for those of you who haven't been here before, my name is Derek Royden. I do usually one of these vlogs a week. I'm a little late this week. I also write for a website called nationofchange.org. I encourage you to check out the site, but you can also get there or get to my stories through this blog. If you're on YouTube, you'll find a link to the blog below. So before I get started on today's story, I'd like to give an update to my last story, which part of it was about a grizzly bear hunt in Yellowstone National Park in the United States. A judge has ordered that this will not go ahead. Her name was Dina Christensen, and basically this is just really good news. They were going to kind of allow people to trophy hunt up to 23 grizzly bears this fall, so that's not going to happen. So great news there. So for today's story, it's another environmental story. I've been doing a lot of these lately. I'm going to, of course, try to vary it up, but I do find that, kind of finding stories about the environment on a day-to-day basis can be somewhat difficult. So I try to go through and find things that might be of interest to whoever's watching this. So this one's from The Guardian, and it's a short one, so hopefully this will be a short video today. It's by James Bridle, and he's an author, and the title is Air Pollution Rots Our Brains. Is that why we don't do anything about it? There's a weird disconnect between the article and the title, but we'll talk about that a bit later. In Mike Judge's 2006 comedy, Bridle begins, Idiocracy, the participants in an ill-fated cryogenics experiment awake 500 years in the future to discover that due to dysgenic mutation, anti-intellectualism, and corporate capitalism, the intelligence of the population has fallen to dangerous levels. The president is sponsored by fast food chain Carl's Jr., and crops are failing because the fields are irrigated with energy drinks. The film was abandoned by its studio and largely ignored at the box office, but its subsequent cult status might be in danger once again, this time from the overbearing reality of present events. I don't know if most of you have probably seen Idiocracy. It's a pretty funny movie. I haven't watched it in a few years. I don't know if it would hold up as much, just kind of to the mores of our time, even though it's only 12 years later. But anyway, Bridle goes on. Researchers from Beijing University and Yale School of Health published research last month showing that people who live in major cities, which is today most of us, are not only suffering from increases in respiratory illnesses and other chronic conditions due to air pollution, but are losing our cognitive functions. The study showed that high pollution levels lead to significant drops in test scores in language and arithmetic, with the impact on some participants equivalent to losing several years of education. Other studies have shown that high air pollution is linked to premature birth, low birth weight, mental illness in children, and dementia in the elderly. We're only just beginning to understand how the air we breathe affects not just our physical environment, but our mental capacity as well. The air we breathe is changing in the long term, as well as the short. Rising carbon dioxide levels, the main driver of climate change, aren't just a hazard to the Earth and other living creatures, they're also affecting our thinking. At higher levels, CO2 clouds the mind. It makes us slower and less likely to develop new ideas. It degrades our ability to take in new information, change our minds, or formulate complex thoughts. Global atmospheric CO2 levels passed 400 parts per million in 2016. And despite global agreements to keep runaway climate change under control, with the exception, of course, of the United States pulling out of the Paris Agreement, little action has been taken. And we should mention that too, that even though everyone signed on to this, very little has been done. The very worst case scenario, aka business as usual, which is the track we're on, predicts atmospheric CO2 concentration of 1,000 parts per million by 2011, or 2100, excuse me. At 1,000 ppm, human cognitive ability drops by 21%. It's just crazy. This isn't merely a problem for the future, as if that would make it better. As we've come to understand more about the effects of CO2, we have been measuring more of it and finding that it increases as it increases outside, it increases inside too. Outdoor CO2 already reaches 500 parts per million regularly in industrial cities. Indoors, in poorly ventilated homes or school workplaces, it can regularly exceed 1,000 parts per million. A study of bedrooms in Denmark found that overnight concentrations of CO2 exceeded 2,000 parts per million, with measurable effects on students' performance the following day. Schools in California and Texas, when measured in 2012, regularly exceeded 2,000 parts per million in the daytime, and the kind of green insulation used to improve the heat retention of buildings, a climate change mitigation process, also unfortunately raises the levels of CO2 trapped inside. So even if we meet the most stringent targets set at the Paris Agreement in 2015, 2100 will bring atmospheric CO2 levels to 660 parts per million, with around a 15% decrease in average brain power. It's possibly one of the most tragic ironies of the whole sorry business that climate change is making it harder for us to think, just when we need new and bold ideas to deal with its effects. Rather than taking action to mitigate the process, we find case and case again of companies actively trying to increase emissions. He goes on to talk about how, there was a Volkswagen was caught using software in order to make it appear as if they were meeting the emission standards in the United States, and of course they weren't. I think it was something like they were 40 times the legal limit. It's been estimated, as Biddle writes, that 1,200 people will die a decade earlier due to VW's emissions, and many more, as we now know, will have cognitive difficulties. It's not hard to see an allegory between Volkswagen's manipulation of opaque technologies and the ways in which we are being manipulated more broadly by the largely unaccountable systems we engage with every day. Multiple studies have shown that the way in which social media regulates our information intake for profit leaves us more divided, less politically aware, and increasingly prejudiced and violent. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced recently that it was reconsidering Obama-era rules governing the emission of mercury from coal-fired power plants. Symptoms of mercury poisoning include emotional instability, insomnia, reduced cognitive function, and memory loss. It was the use of mercury to stiffen hat brims that caused an epidemic of dementia among milliners in the 18th and 19th centuries. The origin of the phrase "mad as a hatter," which is just kind of interesting. It's hard to think of a measure better tuned to canceling the future than raising the amount of mercury in the environment, or an act more in keeping with our times than intentionally increasing the recklessness, forgetfulness, and stupidity of the population. But then those in charge of our affairs currently have their own chemical load to shed. Since the 1980s, one common pollutant we have managed to curtail is lead, mostly by excluding it from paint, plumbing, and petrol. As a result, there has been a 4.5-point rise in IQ points in those born after 1985. I don't fit into that group. Those who grew up in Europe and North America between 1965 and 1985, the cohort who are running things now, were regularly found to be carrying 20 micrograms per deciliter levels of lead in their bloodstream, which can lead to far greater levels of long-term cognitive impairment than those reported in studies of contemporary air conditioning. If you want one simple explanation for the widely differing political attitudes between current generations and some of the irrational paths we seem hell-bent on taking at present, you could do worse than take lead poisoning into account. Brain damage, it seems, is the one thing the baby boomers are willing to pass on to their kids. So, there's not much you can do about this. You can, of course, fill your house with beautiful plants like this one. They will absorb some of the carbon, but it is something that we need to think about. Once again, as I seem to say every time I do one of these videos, it's not just CO2, it's not just climate change, it's not just biodiversity loss, it's cultural as well. And unless we change the way we live, the way we build, the way we look at industry and the economy, things are just going to get worse and worse. And unfortunately, according to this article and the Yale study, people are just going to get dumber and dumber. So that's it for today. Thanks very much for watching, and always remember,